Daniel Cole had 30 seconds to stop a $50 million contract from being signed, and he was standing in the wrong building. He had driven across town with his daughter's school project still open on the passenger seat, half finished, glue not yet dry. His phone was ringing in his pocket. He did not answer it. He pushed through the glass doors of Cross Industries and told the woman at the front desk that he needed to see Elena Cross before she signed anything. The woman looked at him the way people look at a fire alarm that will not stop. Daniel was not important. He knew that. He was a mid-level auditor at a firm that had been hired to check paperwork nobody expected anyone to actually read. He had read it anyway. He always read the paperwork, every line, every footnote, because the last time someone in his family had trusted a company to be honest, it had cost his father his health and his job and, eventually, his life. He rode the elevator to the 40th floor with his heart hammering and his hands cold. When the doors opened, he could already hear the room, applause, camera shutters, a voice, warm and practiced, thanking a small town for its trust. Elena Cross stood at the front of a glass conference room, pen in hand, the contract open on the table in front of her. $50 million. A deal that would bring jobs to a town that had been begging for them for a decade. Reporters lined the back wall. Her assistant, Grace Whitfield, stood just behind her shoulder, smiling the practiced smile of someone who had helped build this moment for months. Daniel stepped into the doorway. "Don't sign that." The room turned toward him at once, and for a moment nobody moved. Elena lowered the pen, slowly, the way people do when they are deciding whether something is a threat or an inconvenience. "Who let him in here?" someone muttered. Daniel did not wait to be invited to explain himself. He had learned, a long time ago, that silence only helps the people who already have power. "The inspection reports behind this contract are false," he said. "Not old and outdated, falsified, on purpose. I can prove it." Grace Whitfield stepped forward, already reaching for her phone to call security. Elena raised one hand, and Grace stopped. Elena Cross was 38 years old, and she had spent every one of the last 10 years being underestimated in rooms exactly like this one. She did not scare easily, and she did not like being interrupted, but there was something in the way this stranger said the word falsified that made her chest go tight before her mind caught up to why. "You have 30 seconds, she said. "Then security removes you and this deal proceeds." Daniel opened the folder in his hands. He pulled the first page free and set it down in the center of the table, right on top of the contract she had been about to sign. "This is a safety inspection from your Ridgeview manufacturing plant," he said. "It says the plant passed with no violations. I found the real report underneath it, buried in an old archive. The real report says the plant failed, badly. Structural failure risk, chemical exposure risk. It was buried and replaced the week before it would have gone to federal regulators." Someone in the back of the room had stopped clapping and started recording. "That report is 15 years old," Elena said. Her voice did not shake, but something behind her eyes had gone very still. "It has nothing to do with this contract." "It has everything to do with this contract," Daniel said, "because the company using this exact plant, under this exact ownership structure, is the same company you are about to hand $50 million and 800 jobs to, and the person who signed off on burying that original report 15 years ago was your father." The room went silent in a way that rooms rarely go silent. Even the cameras seemed to hold still. Elena's hand, the one still holding the pen, did not move, but her knuckles had gone white around it. "You don't get to say his name in this room," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to hurt you," Daniel said, and for the first time his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough that the reporters in the back leaned forward to catch it. "My father worked at that plant, 19 years old at the time, apprentice mechanic. He was one of the workers hurt when the structure your father's report said was safe actually collapsed a support beam 6 months later. He carried that injury the rest of his life. He never sued. He never talked to a reporter. He just quietly fell apart for the next 20 years, and I watched it happen, and I didn't understand why until 3 days ago." Grace Whitfield had stopped reaching for her phone. Elena looked down at the report on the table. She looked at the date. She looked at the signature at the bottom, faded but legible, the handwriting she had seen on birthday cards and school permission slips, and one folded note tucked into a box she had never fully opened after the funeral. "Get everyone out," she said. Nobody moved. "Get everyone out of this room," Elena said again, louder this time. And this time they moved, reporters grumbling, cameras still rolling as they backed toward the door, Grace ushering them out with the practiced calm of someone whose whole job depended on never letting a crisis look like a crisis. When the door closed, it was only Daniel, Elena, and the folder between them. "Explain," Elena said. "Everything. Now." Daniel pulled the chair out across from her and sat down without being asked, because some conversations only happen if you refuse to leave the room. "My name is Daniel Cole," he said. "I have a daughter. I work nights auditing supply chain paperwork for companies that hire firms like mine to make sure nobody gets embarrassed by their own contracts. 3 days ago, I was assigned to review this one. Routine. Boring. Then I found a clause that didn't match what your team told the town council last month, and I started pulling the thread. And the thread led to my father. The thread led to a plant that has been quietly rebuilt, restructured, and renamed 3 times in 15 years, Daniel said. Every time it gets close to another safety audit, it changes shape just enough to slide past the people checking. I don't think you knew that. I think somebody on your team did, and let you walk into this deal blind." Elena sat down slowly across from him, the pen still in her hand, forgotten now, useless. "My father built this company from nothing," she said. "I have spent every year since he died trying to be worthy of what he built." "I know what that feels like," Daniel said. "I spent years trying to understand why my father flinched every time someone mentioned factory work. I thought it was pride. I thought it was stubbornness. It wasn't. It was 30 years of carrying an injury he was told, on paper, never happened." Elena's eyes were dry, but her voice had gone somewhere far away. "Show me the original report," she said. "The real one." Daniel slid it across the table. She read it in silence. The room outside was full of noise, footsteps, murmuring reporters, someone already typing a headline that would be online before she finished the last paragraph. Inside the room, there was only the sound of paper. When she finished, she set it down very carefully, like it might break. $50 million, she said. 800 jobs, all built on top of this. "I didn't come here to destroy your company," Daniel said. "I came here because I couldn't sign off on a deal that buries the same lie twice." Elena looked up at him, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, she looked less like a CEO and more like a woman who had just found out the floor she had been standing on her whole life had never been solid at all. "Then you'd better start explaining exactly how deep this goes," she said, "because I am not walking out of this room until I understand every single thing my father did." Grace Whitfield knocked once and stepped back inside without waiting for permission, her phone in her hand, her face pale under the office lighting. "It's on 3 news sites already," she said. "They have a clip of you saying the word falsified. Legal wants to talk to you in the next 10 minutes. "Tell legal to wait," Elena said, without looking away from Daniel. "Elena, the board will be calling within the hour." "Then let them call." Grace hesitated in the doorway, glancing between her boss and the stranger who had just detonated the biggest deal of the year in front of a room full of cameras. She had worked for Elena Cross for 6 years. She had never once heard her voice sound like this, flat and careful, like someone walking across ice they already knew was cracked. "Should I call security back in?" Grace asked quietly. "No," Elena said. "Close the door." Grace closed it. For a moment neither of them spoke. Daniel could hear his own pulse in his ears. He had rehearsed this confrontation 100 times on the drive over, and in every version he had imagined Elena Cross either exploding with anger or calling for guards to drag him out. He had not imagined this. He had not imagined her going quiet and small and looking, just for a second, like a person instead of a headline. "Tell me about your father," Elena said. "Not the injury, him. Who was he?" Daniel had not expected the question, and it caught somewhere behind his ribs. "His name was Arthur Cole," he said. "He fixed machines for a living because he liked understanding how things worked, and he liked fixing things that were broken more than he liked most people. He used to tell me that a machine never lies to you. If it breaks for a reason, and if you find the reason, you can fix it." He believed that about people too, for a long time. He believed if something was wrong, someone honest would eventually find it and make it right. What happened to that belief? He watched a support beam collapse 8 feet from where he was standing, Daniel said. He got out with a spine injury that never fully healed, and a company that told him, in writing, that the plant had passed every safety inspection that year. He spent the next 2 decades in pain that officially did not exist, according to paperwork that officially proved him wrong. Elena's jaw tightened. "He never sued," Daniel went on. "He never went to a reporter. He just got quieter every year. By the time I was old enough to ask him what was wrong, he had already decided that nobody was going to believe a mechanic over a signed inspection report. He died 4 years ago. The last thing he ever told me about that job was that he hoped, someday, somebody would find the real paperwork before it disappeared for good." The room was very quiet. "And you found it," Elena said. "I found it by accident, looking for something else entirely," Daniel said. "I almost didn't open the old archive folder at all. I almost closed my laptop and went to bed. My daughter had a school project due, and I was tired, and none of this was technically my job to dig into. But something about the clause I found didn't sit right, and I have spent my whole life learning not to ignore that feeling." Elena looked down at the folded, faded signature on the old report again. She traced the edge of it with one finger, not touching the ink itself, like she was afraid it might smear if she pressed too hard, even after 15 years. "I have spent 10 years running this company the way I thought he would have wanted," she said. "Every decision, I ask myself what would he have done. I built half my reputation on the idea that he left this place spotless, that whatever mistakes came later were mine, not his." "Maybe they still were," Daniel said. "Maybe he made one bad call under pressure, a long time ago, and spent the rest of his life trying to bury it instead of fix it. That doesn't erase whatever good he built afterward, but it doesn't erase this either. Both things can be true." Elena looked up at him sharply, like the sentence had landed somewhere she was not ready for it to land. "That's a very generous thing to say," she said, "for a man whose father was hurt because of what my father did." "I didn't come here to be generous," Daniel said. "I came here because burying this deal today stops 800 more workers from standing on the same shaky floor my father stood on. What I decide to feel about your father is a separate problem. Today, I only cared about stopping the signature." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Outside, phones buzzed against the glass walls, the muffled sound of a company already beginning to shake. "You destroyed $50 million in about 90 seconds, she said finally. "I know. Most people in your position would have taken this to a lawyer first. Built a case quietly, sold the story for money, or leverage, or both. Most people in my position don't have a dead father whose name never made it into any official record of what actually happened to him," Daniel said. "I wasn't interested in leverage. I was interested in the truth existing somewhere other than a drawer in an old archive nobody was ever supposed to open again." Elena closed the folder gently, both hands flat against the cover, like she was holding something down that wanted to fly open again on its own. "Then you and I are going to spend the rest of today finding out exactly how deep this goes," she said. "Because if my father buried one report to protect this company, I need to know what else is buried underneath it, and I need to know before the board decides to bury you along with the story." Daniel held her gaze and did not look away. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not until every family that report hurt gets the truth it was owed 15 years ago." Outside the glass walls, the story was already spreading. Inside them, something much older than a business deal had just cracked open, and neither of them yet knew how far the cracks would run. By 6 in the evening, the 40th floor of Cross Industries had emptied out, except for a handful of lights and 2 people who refused to stop working. Elena had ordered the boardroom cleared of everyone, but Daniel, Grace, and a lawyer named Henry Voss, who had worked for the company since before Elena was old enough to understand what her father did for a living. Henry sat at the end of the table with his sleeves rolled up and a legal pad in front of him that was already covered in notes, most of them crossed out. "The board wants a statement in 3 hours," Grace said, reading from her phone. "Something that explains the collapse of the Ridgeview deal without admitting to falsified records, because the word falsified is already a legal problem, not just a public relations one." "I'm not writing a statement that hides what's true," Elena said. "I didn't say hide it," Grace said. "I said we need to be careful how it's framed until we actually know what we're dealing with." "We know what we're dealing with," Daniel said. He had spread 3 folders across the table, each one thinner than the last, each one older. "This isn't one bad report from 15 years ago. It's a pattern." Henry Voss leaned forward, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Walk me through it, slowly." Daniel tapped the first folder. "This is the Ridgeview plant report from 15 years ago. Passed. Signed by Richard Cross." He tapped the second folder. "This is a facility 3 states over, renamed twice, that failed an inspection 9 years ago for almost identical structural issues. The report that eventually became public was corrected before it reached the state regulator. Not falsified in the same obvious way, but softened, reworded, enough to slide through." "Softened by who?" Elena asked. "By someone using the same internal review process your father set up 15 years ago, Daniel said. "A process that routes safety concerns through legal and compliance before they ever reach an outside regulator. On paper, that sounds responsible. In practice, it means anyone inside this company who wants to bury something bad has a built-in shortcut to do it quietly." Elena's face had gone very still, the same stillness Daniel had seen in the conference room hours earlier. "And the third folder," she said. Daniel hesitated before answering, which told her everything before he even opened his mouth. "The third folder is from 18 months ago," he said. "A different plant, same review process. A worker named Miriam Okafor filed an internal safety complaint about faulty wiring near a chemical storage area. The complaint disappeared from the system within 2 weeks. Officially, it was never filed. I found the deleted record in a backup archive that somebody forgot still existed. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning." 18 months ago, Elena repeated. "That's not my father, that's me. I was running this company 18 months ago." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "Then either someone did this without my knowledge," Elena said, "or someone did this because they believed I would want them to." Henry Voss set down his pen. "Elena, before you say anything else in this room, I need to remind you that anything you say here can become part of a legal record if this ever goes to litigation." "I don't care," Elena said. "I want to know who buried Miriam Okafor's complaint, and I want to know tonight." Grace had gone very quiet, staring at her phone screen without actually reading it. "Grace," Elena said, "you've run point on internal compliance escalations for 2 years. Do you know anything about this?" Grace looked up, and for a moment, nobody in the room breathed. "I know the name," Grace said carefully. "I remember the complaint coming in. I remember it being flagged as a priority review. And then what happened to it?" "It went to legal," Grace said. "Standard process. After that, I don't know. I assumed it had been resolved because I never heard about it again." "You didn't follow up," Elena said. "It was not quite an accusation, but it was close." "I follow up on hundreds of things a week," Grace said, her voice tightening. "I trusted the process you built to actually work the way it was supposed to." Daniel watched the exchange the way he had learned to watch conversations at work, listening for the gap between what someone said and what they were actually protecting. Grace's discomfort felt real. Her surprise felt real too. But something in the way she said "the process you built" made Daniel wonder whether she believed, somewhere underneath the professionalism, that the system had been designed to fail exactly like this. "Where is Miriam Okafor now?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I do," Daniel said. He slid a printed page across the table. "She still works for a subcontractor tied to this company. Same wiring issue she reported. Still unresolved. According to a maintenance log I found buried 3 folders deep in a record system nobody outside legal ever looks at." Elena picked up the page and read it twice before setting it down. "I want her found tonight," she said. "Not fired, not silenced. Found, and told the truth, and given whatever protection she needs if this becomes public, which it will." Henry Voss rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Elena, I need to say this clearly. If you go public with all 3 of these findings tomorrow, you are not just admitting fault in one old report. You are opening this company to investigations that could take years, cost far more than $50 million, and possibly end with criminal liability for people still working here today." "I'm aware," Elena said. "Are you also aware," Henry said, "that some of those people might include your father, posthumously, in a way that becomes the headline every single article writes about him for the rest of history?" The room went silent again. Elena looked at the old, faded signature at the bottom of the first report, the one she had touched so carefully hours earlier like it might shatter. "My father is already gone," she said. "He doesn't get hurt by the truth anymore. The people still working in these buildings do. I would rather be the daughter who told the truth about him than the CEO who protected a lie to protect a reputation." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, something he had not expected to feel standing in this room. He had come here angry. He had come here certain that Elena Cross would be exactly like the version of her he had built in his head over 3 sleepless nights, a woman who cared more about a signature than the people underneath it. Instead, he was watching her choose, in real time, the harder version of every decision in front of her. "There's one more thing," Daniel said. Elena looked at him, waiting. "The original report," he said, "the real one, it wasn't just buried. It was replaced with a duplicate report using the same document number, the same date, almost the same formatting. Whoever did it wanted it to be found eventually, in a strange way. A careful forger destroys the evidence completely. Whoever did this kept the real report intact somewhere it could still be recovered. They just made sure nobody would look for it unless they already suspected something was wrong." Elena frowned. Why would anyone bury something and preserve it at the same time? "I don't know yet," Daniel said. "But I think whoever archived that folder wanted a way for the truth to survive, even if they weren't the one brave enough to bring it forward themselves." Grace's face had gone unreadable, carefully blank in the way people go blank when they are working very hard not to react. Henry Voss finally set down his legal pad entirely. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then somebody inside this company, possibly still working here, has been sitting on evidence of a 15-year-old cover-up and chose, for whatever reason, not to destroy it completely." "Which means," Daniel said, "whoever that person is might already know a great deal more than any of us do right now." Elena looked around the table, at Grace, at Henry, at the folders spread out like the pieces of a story none of them had asked to be part of. "Then we find that person," she said. "Tonight, if we can, because I would rather hear the rest of this from someone inside these walls than read it for the first time in tomorrow's headlines." Daniel gathered the folders together, careful with the oldest one, the one with his father's whole life folded quietly into a single faded line of ink he had never been meant to find. "There's a name in the archive metadata," he said. "Whoever accessed that folder and made the duplicate 15 years ago left a login trail. It's been overwritten twice, but not perfectly. I think I can recover enough of it to tell us who it was." Elena stood up from the table for the first time in over an hour, smoothing down her jacket, squaring her shoulders the way people do when they are about to walk into something they cannot undo. "Then let's stop talking about it," she said, "and go find out." The recovered login trail led to a name none of them expected, and it took Daniel less than an hour to confirm it. sitting alone at a terminal in an IT room 3 floors down, while Elena paced behind him and Henry Voss made phone calls he refused to explain. The name was Malcolm Reyes. Elena stopped pacing. That can't be right. Who is he? Daniel asked. He was my father's personal assistant, Elena said. For almost 20 years. He retired the year my father died. He used to bounce me on his knee when I was 6 years old. He came to the funeral and cried harder than I did. Do you have a way to reach him? I have his number, Elena said. I haven't used it in 3 years. It was almost 9 at night when Malcolm Reyes agreed to meet them. Not at the office, but at a small diner across town that stayed open past midnight for people who worked shifts nobody envied. Daniel drove separately from Elena, both of them arriving within minutes of each other, and when Malcolm Reyes walked in, he looked like a man who had spent 15 years waiting for exactly this night to happen. He was somewhere near 70, with hands that shook slightly around his coffee cup, not from age but from something closer to nerves that had never fully settled. I knew someone would find it eventually, he said, before either of them had asked a single question. I just didn't know it would take this long. Tell me what you did, Elena said. Her voice was quiet, careful, the voice of someone bracing for something she could not yet name. Malcolm wrapped both hands around his coffee cup like it was the only warm thing left in the room. Your father was a good man in almost every way that mattered to me, he said, but he was also a man who built this company out of nothing, with everything he had, and when the Ridgeview inspection came back failing, he panicked, not because he didn't care about the workers, because he had 3 other plants depending on financing that was tied to that safety rating, and if the plant failed publicly, the whole company could have collapsed. Hundreds of jobs, not just the ones at Ridgeview. So he chose the company over the workers, Daniel said, and it was not a question. He chose it the way people choose things when they've convinced themselves it's temporary, Malcolm said. He told me it would only be for 1 report cycle. He told me he would fix the actual structural problems quietly, on his own budget, without ever telling regulators there had been a failure at all. He believed, truly believed, that fixing it quietly was the same as fixing it honestly. Was it fixed? Elena asked. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment. Some of it, he said. Not all of it. Fixing it completely would have required shutting the plant down for months, and by then there were 3 more contracts riding on it staying open. So he patched what he could and buried the rest, and he told himself every single year that this would be the year he finally went back and finished the job properly. He never did, Daniel said. He never did, Malcolm agreed, and the longer he waited, the more it would have cost him to admit the truth, because by then it wasn't just 1 bad report anymore. It was 10 years of decisions that all depended on the first lie staying buried. Elena's hands were flat on the table, pressing down like she needed something solid to hold on to. Why did you keep the real report instead of destroying it? She asked. Malcolm looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I loved him, and I hated what he was doing, and I didn't have the courage to choose between those 2 things while he was alive, he said. I told myself that if I kept the real report intact, somewhere, buried but not gone, then someday, if it mattered enough, the truth could still come out without me being the one who had to destroy his legacy myself. I was a coward. I want to say that plainly. I hid the truth because I was afraid, and I told myself that hiding it carefully was different from lying. Daniel thought of his father, sitting quietly at the kitchen table for 20 years, saying nothing, believing nothing would ever change. There's someone else you need to know about, Daniel said. A worker named Miriam Okafor. Her safety complaint was buried 18 months ago, using almost the exact same process your former employer's company still runs on today. Malcolm's face went pale. That's not me. I haven't worked there in years. I know, Daniel said, but the process you helped build outlived the man who asked you to use it. Somebody else picked it up, either by accident or on purpose, and used it the exact same way. Elena's phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at it without picking it up. Grace's name flashed on the screen, over and over, 4 missed calls in the last 10 minutes. Something's wrong, Elena said, standing up. Grace never calls like this. She answered on the 5th ring, and Daniel watched her face change as she listened, the color draining from it in real time. Say that again, Elena said into the phone. A pause. Where is she now? Another pause, longer this time. I'm coming, Elena said, and hung up. What happened? Daniel asked. Miriam Okafor, Elena said. The subcontractor she works for just terminated her position 20 minutes ago, officially for budget reasons. Grace thinks someone inside the company found out we were looking for her and moved to get rid of her before she could talk to us. That's not budget reasons, Daniel said. That's a cover-up in real time. I know, Elena said, already pulling her coat on. And it means whoever is running that same broken process my father started 15 years ago is still active, still protecting themselves, and now they know we're looking. Malcolm Reyes stood up slowly, steadying himself against the edge of the table. There's one more thing you need to know before you walk out of here, he said. The person who currently oversees that internal review process, the one Miriam's complaint disappeared into, reports directly to your assistant. The diner went very quiet. Elena's face did not move for a long moment. Grace, she said, very quietly, like she was testing whether the word could still mean the same thing it had meant an hour ago. I'm not saying she buried it herself, Malcolm said quickly. I'm saying whoever did, she would have had to sign off on the process at some point, even if she never looked closely at what it hid. Daniel felt the shape of the whole night rearranging itself. He thought of Grace's carefully blank face in the boardroom hours earlier, the way she had said, "I trusted the process you built," like the sentence had cost her something to say out loud. We need to get to Miriam Okafor before anyone else does, Daniel said. Tonight. Before her termination becomes permanent, before her story gets quietly discredited, before this whole thing gets buried a second time in one night. Elena was already moving toward the door, phone in hand, dialing Grace back. I need her address, she said to Daniel. Now. Daniel pulled it up on his phone as they walked, the three of them crossing the parking lot together under a sky gone completely dark, no stars visible through the glow of the city, just the sound of 3 sets of footsteps moving fast toward a car and a woman none of them had ever met, but who was, in this moment, the only person who could tell them exactly how far the lie had traveled since Arthur Cole first felt the beam give way beneath him 30 years ago. They reached Miriam Okafor's apartment complex just after 11, the building quiet except for a single porch light glowing over a row of mailboxes. Elena knocked twice before a woman in her 40s opened the door, wary, exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. I already know who you are, Miriam said, before Elena could introduce herself. I saw the news clip 3 hours ago, and I got a call 20 minutes before that telling me my contract was terminated. Funny how those two things happened on the same night. We're not here to hurt you, Elena said. We're here because I need to know exactly what happened to your complaint, and I need to know if you're willing to tell it publicly. Miriam studied her for a long moment, arms crossed, the porch light casting a hard shadow across her face. Why should I trust the daughter of the man whose company started all of this? She said. Daniel stepped forward before Elena could answer. Because my father waited 30 years for someone to finally believe him, he said, and he died without ever getting that. I'm not going to let that happen to you too. Miriam looked at him for a long moment, something in his voice reaching a part of her that had clearly stopped expecting anyone to listen. Come inside, she said finally, stepping back from the door. But you'd better be ready to hear all of it, because I've been carrying this alone for a year and a half, and I am done being quiet. Inside the small apartment, Miriam Okafor set 3 mugs of tea on the table that nobody touched, and told her story in a voice that had clearly rehearsed it many times, alone, to an empty room, waiting for someone to finally ask. 18 months ago, I noticed wiring near the chemical storage area that had been patched instead of properly replaced, she said. I filed a complaint the same day, the way I was trained to. 2 weeks later, I got a message saying the complaint had been reviewed and resolved. Nobody ever came to look at the wiring. I checked the system myself a month later, out of habit, and the complaint wasn't just marked resolved. It was gone, as if I had never filed it at all. Did you file it again? Daniel asked. I tried, Miriam said. The second time, I was told the wiring issue had already been addressed in a prior inspection cycle, and that continuing to raise it could be viewed as a pattern of unfounded complaints against my supervisor. That's a polite way of telling someone to be quiet, or lose their job. Elena's jaw was tight. Who told you that? A woman named Grace Whitfield, Miriam said. I only spoke to her once, on the phone. She was very calm, very professional. She told me the company took safety seriously and that my concerns had been documented and considered. The room went still. Elena's phone was already buzzing again, Grace's name lighting up the screen for the 6th time that night. Elena stared at it without answering, her thumb hovering over the green circle like it might burn her. I need to hear this from her directly, Elena said. Tonight. Before you do, Daniel said, I want to understand something. If Grace was the one telling workers to be quiet, why would she also be the one who spent all afternoon looking uncomfortable every time this came up? People who are hiding something usually get better at hiding it, not worse. Unless she's hiding two different things, Miriam said quietly. Being told to bury something and being the one who decided to actually do it are not always the same choice. Elena finally answered the call, putting it on speaker without asking anyone's permission. Grace, she said, I'm with Miriam Okafor right now. She just told me you personally discouraged her from raising a wiring complaint 18 months ago, using language that sounds a lot like a threat. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Daniel thought the call might have dropped. I need you to come back to the office, Grace said finally, her voice tight and strange. Tonight, there's something I should have told you a long time ago, and I would rather say it to your face than over the phone. Tell me now, Elena said. Elena, please, Grace said, and for the first time all night her voice cracked completely. Come back. I'll tell you everything. I just can't do it like this. Elena looked at Daniel, then at Miriam, weighing something neither of them could fully see. We're coming, she said, and Miriam is coming with us, because whatever you have to say, she deserves to hear it too. The drive back to Cross Industries took 18 minutes that felt like an hour. Nobody spoke much. Miriam sat in the back seat of Elena's car with her arms crossed, watching the city lights slide past the window, 30 seconds away from finally being believed after a year and a half of being told she was imagining things. Grace was waiting for them in the same boardroom where the whole night had started, standing at the window with her back to the door, her reflection ghostly against the dark glass and the city lights beyond it. She turned when they came in, and her face was tear-stained in a way none of them had ever seen from her before. I didn't bury Miriam's complaint because I wanted to hurt her, Grace said, before anyone could speak. I buried it because I was told to. By who? Elena said. Grace's hands were shaking. By your father, Elena. Not directly. Through a set of standing instructions he left in place before he died, instructions that were never officially written down anywhere except in a private memo he gave to exactly two people. Malcolm Reyes was one. I was the other. The room went utterly silent. He told me, near the end, when he already knew he was dying, that certain safety concerns tied to Ridgeview and its sister facilities needed to be handled quietly, through internal review only, never escalated externally, no matter what, Grace said. He told me it was to protect thousands of jobs from a single old mistake that had already, in his words, mostly been fixed. He asked me to keep that instruction alive after he was gone, as a favor to him, as a way of protecting the company he built. I was 26 years old. I had worked for him for 2 years. I said yes because I didn't know how to say no to a man who was dying in front of me. And you never told me, Elena said. Her voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. I told myself I was protecting you from having to make an impossible choice, Grace said. I told myself if it never came up again, it would never have to become your problem. When Miriam's complaint came in 18 months ago, I panicked. I followed the instruction exactly the way your father gave it to me, without stopping to ask whether it was still the right thing to do, or whether it had ever been the right thing to do at all. Miriam Okafor's arms were still crossed, her jaw tight, listening to a stranger explain, in careful corporate language, why her voice had been erased from a system that was supposed to protect her. "Do you know how it felt," Miriam said, "to report something dangerous and be told, kindly, professionally, that I was the problem instead of the wiring?" Grace turned to her, and for the first time that night, her composure broke completely. "No," she said, "I don't know how that felt, and I am ashamed that I never let myself imagine it clearly enough to refuse the instruction I was given. I was following a promise I made to a dying man instead of listening to a living person standing right in front of me, and I will spend a long time trying to understand how I let that happen." Elena sat down slowly at the head of the table, the same table where she had almost signed a $50 million contract 12 hours earlier, back when she had believed the worst thing in this room could be a falsified inspection report from 15 years ago instead of a private instruction her father had left behind, like a hidden fault line running straight through the company's foundation. "So it wasn't one mistake," she said quietly. "It was a system, built on purpose, maintained on purpose, for 15 years. "Yes," Grace said. "And you kept it running." "Yes," Grace said again, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I did." Daniel watched Elena absorb the full shape of what her father had built, not just a company, but a quiet machine designed to protect itself at the expense of anyone standing too close to its moving parts when something finally broke. He thought of his own father, patient and silent for 30 years, believing that somewhere, eventually, someone honest would find the truth and make it right. He had been half right. It had just taken far longer and far more damage than anyone should have had to survive. "I want every internal complaint filed against this company in the last 15 years, pulled and reviewed," Elena said. "Every single one. I don't care how many there are or how long it takes. I want to know exactly how many people were told to be quiet, the way Miriam was told to be quiet." "Elena," Henry Voss said carefully, "that is going to take months, and it is going to expose this company to more liability than you can currently calculate." "I don't care," Elena said. "I have spent tonight learning that my father built half of what I'm proud of on top of a promise to protect a lie instead of protect people. I am not doing the same thing twice in one lifetime." Grace wiped her face with the back of her hand, steadying herself against the edge of the table. "What happens to me?" she asked quietly. Elena looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Not quite forgiveness, not quite condemnation, something still being decided in real time. "That depends on what you do in the next 24 hours, Elena said. "Starting with helping Miriam get everything she is owed, and helping me find every other name buried in that system before the sun comes up." The sun came up on a company that no longer looked anything like the one that had gone to sleep the night before. By 7 in the morning, Henry Voss had assembled a small team of outside lawyers, not to protect Cross Industries from the truth, but to make sure the truth, once released, could not be twisted into something smaller and safer by anyone still hoping to protect themselves. Elena had not slept. Neither had Daniel. They sat across from each other in the same boardroom, surrounded now by folders instead of cameras, the quiet after a storm rather than the noise before one. "I want to hold a press conference," Elena said. "Today, not a statement written by legal to sound careful. Me, standing in front of people, telling them exactly what we found. That will hurt the company more than yesterday's collapsed deal," Henry said. "I know," Elena said. "It will also be true, which is more than I can say for most of what this company has told the public for the last 15 years. Daniel had spent the early morning hours going through what remained of the buried complaints with a small team Elena had assembled overnight, people pulled from compliance and legal who had no idea, until a few hours earlier, that any of this had been happening under their own roof. The number that came back by mid-morning was worse than any of them had expected. 14 complaints, across 6 facilities, spanning 9 years, all routed through the same quiet instruction Grace Whitfield had followed out of loyalty to a dying man's request. Not all of them involved injuries. Some were near misses, caught by luck rather than oversight. 2 of them, if they had gone unaddressed much longer, could have ended the way Arthur Cole's accident had ended 30 years earlier, or worse. 14 people, Elena said, reading the list slowly. 14 people who did exactly what they were supposed to do and were punished for it instead of protected. 15, if you count my father, Daniel said quietly. Even though his complaint predates the instruction Grace was given, the pattern didn't start with her. It started the day your father decided a quiet lie was safer than a loud, expensive truth. Elena closed the folder in front of her. Then that's how the press conference starts, she said. Not with an apology, with his name, with what actually happened to him. People deserve to hear the beginning of this story, not just the parts that are convenient to admit. At noon, Elena Cross stood in front of a room full of cameras for the second time in 24 hours, but this time there was no pen in her hand and no contract on the table behind her. Daniel stood off to the side, near Miriam Okafor, who had agreed, after a long conversation that morning, to say a few words of her own once Elena finished. Yesterday, in this building, a man stopped me from signing a $50 million contract, Elena began, her voice steady despite the exhaustion behind it. He told me that a safety report tied to this deal had been falsified 15 years ago. He was right. What I did not know, until last night, was how far that falsification had traveled, and how many people paid for it in the years since. She told them about Arthur Cole, about the beam that gave way, and the report that said it never had. She told them about Malcolm Reyes, and the instruction her father left behind before he died, an instruction meant, in his mind, to protect a company built from nothing, but which instead became a quiet machine for silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. She told them about Grace Whitfield, without excusing what had happened, but without erasing the difference between someone who built a lie and someone who inherited one and lacked the courage to break it. And then she told them about Miriam Okafor, and the wiring that still had not been fixed, and the 18 months Miriam had spent being told, politely, that she was the problem. When Elena finished, she stepped back, and Miriam Okafor walked forward to the microphone on legs that did not quite feel steady, and told the room, in her own words, exactly what it had felt like to report something dangerous and be quietly erased for doing it. By the end of the day, the story had stopped being about a collapsed $50 million contract and had become something else entirely, a story about a company finally being forced to look honestly at what it had built. The board did not react well. 2 directors resigned within the week, unwilling to be associated with what they called reckless transparency. Elena did not try to stop them. Grace Whitfield was not fired. Instead, at her own request, she was moved out of compliance oversight entirely and placed in a newly created role focused solely on reviewing every case the company had ever buried, working directly under an outside auditor with no loyalty to anyone inside the building. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to penance, chosen rather than imposed. Miriam Okafor's contract was restored, along with 2 years of back pay and a formal correction to every record that had ever suggested her original complaint was unfounded. The wiring at her facility was finally replaced, this time inspected by an outside firm with no ties to Cross Industries at all. Daniel Cole did not ask for money, and when Elena offered it anyway, quietly, privately, weeks later, he turned it down. "I didn't do this for a payout," he told her, sitting across from her in a much quieter version of the same boardroom, months after the story had faded from the headlines and settled into something closer to memory. "I did it because I spent my whole childhood watching my father carry something he was never allowed to put down. I wanted just once for the truth about him to exist somewhere other than inside his own head." "It does now," Elena said. "There's a plaque going up at the Ridgeview facility next month. His name, on the wall, with an accurate account of what happened to him, not because it fixes anything, because it's true, and it was never allowed to be true out loud before. Daniel thought of his father, sitting at the kitchen table for 20 years, quietly believing that someone, someday, would find the real paperwork before it disappeared for good. He would have liked that, Daniel said. Not the plaque exactly. He never cared much about being remembered. He would have liked knowing it couldn't happen to somebody else's kid the same way it happened to me. Elena nodded slowly, looking down at her hands, at the small scar on her thumb from where a pin had pressed too hard into her skin the day everything started to unravel. My father spent his whole life trying to build something that would outlast him, she said. I don't think he ever imagined it would be the mistakes that outlasted him instead of the company. I'm trying to make sure that's not what people remember, in the end. Not the lie, what we did after we found it. Outside the boardroom window, the city moved the same way it always had, indifferent to the quiet reckoning that had taken place inside these walls. One late night, one folder, one father's name at a time. Daniel stood, ready to leave, ready to go home to a daughter who had no idea her school project had been sitting unfinished in a car seat the night her father changed the direction of a company neither of them had ever expected to matter to their small, ordinary life. Thank you, Elena said, as he reached the door, for not letting this stay buried. Daniel paused, hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Thank you, he said, for choosing to dig, instead of just letting me leave that day without listening. He walked out into the afternoon light, and behind him, for the first time in 15 years, the truth about a broken beam and a buried father finally stood exactly where it belonged, out in the open, where no signature could ever bury it again.